My name is Liam Donovan and I'm 38. I'm holed up in a little house just outside Boulder, right where the ground starts climbing into the Front Range. The wind that cuts through these pines has a voice, and tonight it sounds like it's telling my own story back to me. There was a time I commanded the sky in an F-15E Strike Eagle, a machine that made me feel like the pride of a nation. I was also the favored son of a formidable family, a life that feels like it belonged to someone else entirely. Now my world is just this one room, lit by a single desk lamp that throws long shadows across the walls. I find myself just staring into the dust motes dancing in the light, trying to pinpoint the exact moment the whole structure gave way. This place is small, just big enough for my daughter Chloe and me to exist without bumping into each other too much. It's nothing more than four walls, a sagging couch, and a hearth that stays cold. I can't bring myself to light a fire. The last thing I need is to watch my own memories burn all over again in the flicker of the flames. Dwelling on the past isn't in my nature, or at least it never used to be. My training hammered one thing into my head above all else. Always look ahead. You anticipate the trajectory. You calculate the intercept. You keep your focus absolute as the G's try to crush the consciousness right out of you. But in the profound quiet of this house, with Chloe sleeping soundly in the next room and the world outside holding its breath, that discipline fails me. I can't help but look in the rear view. My mind keeps drifting back to the beginning, and to the brutal, undeniable end. A part of me doesn't want to give this story air. There are some truths so sharp they feel like they should be buried, the way they haul a crashed airframe to a deep pit in the earth so no one has to look at the twisted metal, the ugly scar on the landscape. Still, something in my gut, a last flicker of the man who swore oaths to honor and truth, is pushing me to put words to it. Maybe I'm doing this for Chloe, so that when she's old enough to ask the hard questions, she'll have an answer for why her dad disappeared from the world, why he chose this quiet life when he was built to fly at the edge of the sky. Or maybe, if I'm being honest, this is just for me. I need to trace the flight path of my own downfall just to see if I can finally understand it. My life started in Washington, D.C., inside a house so cavernous that my small footsteps on the marble floors echoed back at me, making me feel like a lone visitor in a grand, empty museum. My father was Senator Alistair Donovan. The public knew him from C-SPAN, from photographs of him shaking hands with foreign dignitaries, and from a smile so polished you could tell it had been practiced for hours. To me, he was a force that changed the air in a room the moment he entered it. He was a man of unbending conservative principles, and the family's public image was his primary creed. Everything and everyone was secondary to that. The Donovan name wasn't just a heritage to him. It was a corporate brand, an institution of power and impeccable honor that had to be managed. As the eldest son, I was the designated custodian of its shine. It was a heavy responsibility for a small boy. There were no scraped knees from climbing trees or muddy sneakers from playing in fields. My world was a rotation of formal dinners and political fundraisers. I was in a tailored suit by the age of 6, taught the precise grip for a handshake, and coached to hold a pleasant expression while the drone of adult conversation washed over me. My mother, a kind woman who seemed to shrink in my father's orbit, did her best to counterbalance the chill. She smuggled warmth into my life through quiet hugs in the hallway and whispered stories after the lights were out. Her comfort was a small, fragile shield, and it was never enough to deflect my father's rigid expectations. He'd catch my eye across a crowded room or stop me in the hall, his voice a low, cutting instrument. "Liam," he would say, the sound sharp enough to make me stand up straighter. "You are a Donovan. Remember those words. Failure is not an option. Weakness is not in our vocabulary. I have a younger brother, Finn, who is 3 years my junior. He was the sun they could breathe around, especially my father. While I was groomed for a life of rigid lines, academic honors, athletic trophies, and a flawless public persona, Finn was allowed to be the artist. He was given the freedom to fill his days with the smell of oil paints, the feel of charcoal on paper, and the sound of the piano echoing through the long halls. He was living a life I envied with a silent, desperate ache. I never resented Finn for it. He was a good kid, always trying to break through my serious exterior with a goofy drawing or a story from his day. He had a lightness I couldn't comprehend. But deep down, a knot of jealousy was always tightening in my stomach. I was jealous that he didn't have to carry the crushing weight of the Donovan name on his back. The only person who seemed to see past the polished exterior was my grandfather, a retired pilot who had flown a P-51 Mustang in World War II. He was nothing like my father. He had no interest in power games or the hollow pursuit of fame. He would sit me down in his study, the air thick with the scent of old leather and pipe tobacco, and tell me about the feeling of being utterly alone above the clouds. He spoke of the freedom, the silence, and the profound humility the sky teaches a man. "Liam," he used to say, his old eyes lighting up with a fire I rarely saw in anyone else, "up there, nobody cares whose son you are. It's just you, the plane, and the quality of your decisions." Those words became my secret creed. They struck a chord deep inside me, igniting a small, steady flame in my chest. In that moment, I knew I had to be a pilot, not to impress my father or add another shiny accomplishment to the family legacy, but to be free, to finally simply be myself. I never breathed a word of it to anyone, but every night I would lie awake, staring at the dark ceiling, my mind already banking through a field of stars. In those silent airborne fantasies, I wasn't Liam Donovan, son of Senator Donovan. I was just Liam, a boy with wings of steel, untouchable as I carved my way through an endless sky. But like every other good thing in my life, that dream was a battle. The year I turned 17, I submitted my application to the United States Air Force Academy in Boulder. Predictably, my father was furious. "A pilot?" he scoffed, the word dripping with condescension, as if I'd announced my intention to join the circus. "You have the connections to be a lawyer, a politician, a governor. Why would you throw that away on a dangerous job with no real future?" I didn't bother to argue. What could I say that he would understand? Instead, I quietly finished my application, mailed it off myself, and held my breath. I refused to use his influence. I needed this to be mine and mine alone. I couldn't bear the thought of anyone believing I'd gotten in on the Donovan name. When the thick acceptance envelope finally arrived, I found a quiet corner and tore it open. The words blurred as tears streamed down my face, not tears of joy, but of a profound, bone-deep relief. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had actually earned something. That feeling, however, was fleeting. I showed my father the letter, my hand still trembling slightly. He glanced at it, gave a curt nod, and said, "Good. Don't embarrass me." That was it. No handshake, no proud clap on the shoulder, not even a simple congratulations. Just another command to be obeyed. I stood there in the middle of our cavernous living room, the acceptance letter clutched in my fist. It felt as if I had just brushed my fingertips against the clouds, only to have him drag me back to earth by the collar. A silent scream was building in my throat. "This is mine!" I wanted to yell. "This has nothing to do with you." But the words never came. I just gave him the nod of an obedient soldier, turned on my heel, and walked away. But inside, that small flame of defiance still burned. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that no matter what he said or did, I was going to fly. This wasn't for him. This was for me. The United States Air Force Academy in Boulder was a shock to the system. It was a new world, one that was stark, unforgiving, and utterly indifferent to my last name. From the moment I first stepped onto the campus, with its imposing gray stone architecture set against the rugged backdrop of the Front Range, I felt a different kind of pressure settle on my shoulders. This was no ivy-covered university. It was a crucible, designed to throw young men like me into the fire to see who would emerge forged and who would simply melt away. My life was stripped down to a brutal routine. Every day started at 500 when a piercing alarm shattered the pre-dawn darkness, a daily reminder that there was no room for softness here. Before the sun had even crested the mountains, we were running, a 10-mile gut check in the thin cold air, our lungs burning with every stride. Then came the relentless academic grind. Aerodynamics, advanced mathematics, air combat theory, and military history lectures that we were expected to absorb verbatim. But the physical exhaustion and the mental strain weren't the hardest parts. What really wore me down were the whispers, the sideways glances from my fellow cadets. "The senator's son," I'd hear them mutter as I walked past, their words laced with a casual, cutting disdain. They were so sure I was a legacy admission, a political favor my father had called in. They had no idea about the nights I'd spent hunched over textbooks until my eyes burned, or the extra hours I'd put in at the gym, pushing my body to its absolute limit just to prove I deserved to be there. I couldn't even blame them for thinking it. In a pressure cooker like the academy, where every cadet was clawing their way to the top, that kind of suspicion was just part of the atmosphere. But every time I heard that nickname, I would feel my fists clench at my sides. "I'll show them," I'd repeat to myself, a silent, furious promise. "I'll show them all." That vow became my fuel. I attacked my studies like every exam was a dogfight, and I ran every drill like it was my last opportunity to prove I wasn't a fraud. There were nights I'd stumble back to my dorm, my entire body screaming with exhaustion, wanting nothing more than to collapse onto my bunk and give in. But then I would see my grandfather's face in my mind's eye, his crinkled, knowing smile and the passion in his voice as he spoke of the sky. And it would be enough to get me back on my feet. I wasn't just running from my father's shadow anymore. I was running toward a version of myself I hadn't met yet. Life at the academy was a 4-year-long test of endurance. I remember mornings spent standing at attention in a downpour, rainwater dripping from the brim of my cap as an instructor screamed in my face because my boots weren't polished to a mirror shine. I remember nights hunched over my desk, my eyes gritty with fatigue, wrestling with a complex aerodynamics equation that felt like the only thing standing between me and failure. But then there were the moments that made every second of the misery worth it. The first time I climbed into a flight simulator and wrapped my hand around the control stick, my heart hammered against my ribs. The screen in front of me flickered to life, revealing a limitless blue horizon. It wasn't real, but the feeling that surged through me was. It was a jolt of pure adrenaline, a taste of the freedom I craved. Amidst all the intensity, I found a friend. My roommate Ben, a lanky kid from Texas with a slow grin and an even slower drawl, became my closest confidant. Ben couldn't have cared less who my father was. To him, I was just Liam, the guy who shared his tiny room and told him stories about his crazy old pilot grandfather. He saw me, not my last name, and for that I was grateful. "You know, Donovan," Ben drawled one night while we were shoveling down a late meal in the mess hall, "I bet your grandpa would be damn proud if he could see you now." It was such a simple thing to say, but his words landed like a direct hit of reinforcement. Ben had no idea how much I needed to hear that. On the days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, his easy friendship was one of the few things that kept me from breaking. And then I met Sarah, She entered my life like a calm, steadying current in the turbulent storm of academy discipline. Sarah was a civilian instructor brought in to teach a mandatory course on stress management for cadets. The first time I saw her, she was standing at the front of the lecture hall in a simple blue blouse, her dark, wavy hair pulled back from her face. Her voice was warm but carried an authority that instantly quieted the room of restless young men. She didn't just lecture from a textbook about coping mechanisms. She told us stories, real stories about pilots who had faced down their own demons, who had overcome crippling psychological hurdles to get back in the cockpit. "You can have perfect control of the aircraft," she said, her green eyes scanning the room, sharp with an intelligence that captivated me. "But if you can't control your own mind, you will never leave the ground." I'm not sure exactly when it started, when my admiration for her shifted into something deeper. Maybe it was the afternoon she asked me to stay after class. She wanted to talk about an essay I'd written, a deeply personal piece about my grandfather and what flying meant to me. "Your story is very moving, Liam," she said, and I felt a hot blush creep up my neck. It wasn't from embarrassment, it was the startling feeling of being truly seen. She looked at me as if she genuinely wanted to understand the person behind the uniform. After that, we started talking more. It began with coursework, then drifted into conversations about our lives, our hopes, our dreams. Sarah was 2 years older than I was, but she never treated me like a kid. Just the opposite, in fact. Being with her made me feel like I could actually take on the world and win. Our first dates were stolen moments. A shared table in the crowded mess hall. A long walk on the winding trails that crisscrossed the campus foothills. She loved to hike, and I loved walking beside her, listening as she talked about her family back in Ohio and her dream of becoming a psychologist who specialized in helping service members. "You know," she said one afternoon as we sat on a large boulder overlooking a sprawling valley, "I think you pilots are so much stronger than anyone gives you credit for. But I worry that in learning how to be strong, you forget how to talk about what's really going on inside." I laughed it off, giving her the standard line about pilots not having time for feelings. But I knew she was right. Her insight chipped away at the walls I had built so carefully around myself, and slowly, piece by piece, I started to let her in. 4 years later, I graduated from the academy at the top of my class. It was a victory I'd bled for, and a foolish part of me hoped it might finally be enough to earn a single, unqualified word of praise from my father. When I called home to tell him the news, his only response was a clipped, "Good. What's next?" I didn't have an answer for him. By then, I was used to the goalposts always moving. I let the disappointment wash over me and then let it go, focusing instead on the next horizon: fighter pilot training. This was the real dream, the pinnacle I had been striving for, and I knew it would demand everything I had and more. The training program was based out of an air base in Texas, and it made the academy look like a vacation. The heat, the pressure, the sheer volume of information, it was more intense than anything I had ever imagined. We started our flight hours in T-38 Talons, sleek little jets that were blindingly fast. The first time I pushed the throttle forward and felt the wheels leave the tarmac, the sensation was indescribable. It was a raw, physical manifestation of everything I had ever wanted. The sky opened up, a limitless expanse of blue, and in that instant I was completely and utterly myself. Not a son, not a legacy, just a man in a machine. Finally where he belonged. But that pure, unadulterated joy was paid for in sweat and fear. Every single flight was a high-stakes examination, a constant battle to master speed, altitude, and angle of attack while simultaneously mastering the surge of adrenaline in your own veins. One lapse in concentration, one flicker of doubt, and you were dead. The survival training was the ultimate test. They dropped us in the middle of the desolate wilderness with nothing but a knife, a compass, and the clothes on our backs. I learned how to find water, how to build a shelter, how to hunt for food, and how to endure a cold so deep it felt like it was freezing my bones from the inside out. I remember nights curled up at the base of a tree, my stomach hollow with hunger, my body shaking with exhaustion, seriously questioning if I had what it took to continue. But in those dark moments, I would think of my grandfather's stories of being shot down behind enemy lines. Liam, I could almost hear him say, "The sky never gives up its secrets easily, but it will make you stronger than you ever thought you could be." And it did. I became stronger. Sarah was my anchor through all of it. She found a job at a psychological research facility near the base in Texas, and we moved into a small apartment together. Her presence was a lifeline. I'd come home after a grueling day of training, my mind and body screaming, and she would somehow wash it all away. We'd collapse on the couch, eat cheap pizza, and lose ourselves in old movies. We talked about the future as if it were a tangible thing we could build together. "You're going to fly an F-15 one day, I know it," she would say, her belief in me more powerful than my own. I'd just laugh and pull her closer. "As long as you're my co-pilot, I can fly anywhere." During my final year of the program, she told me she was pregnant. The news hit me with the force of a sonic boom. I remember sinking into a kitchen chair, the world tilting on its axis. "A baby?" I stammered, the word feeling foreign in my mouth. She laughed, her eyes shining with tears. "Our baby, Liam." I pulled her into a hug, burying my face in her hair, feeling as if the entire universe had just condensed into this tiny apartment. But coiled around the sudden, fierce joy was a thread of pure terror. Me? A father? The thought was paralyzing. I, who had grown up in the long, cold shadow of my own father. How could I possibly know how to be a good one? Sensing my panic, Sarah took my hand in hers, her grip firm and reassuring. "You're going to be an amazing dad, Liam," she whispered. "I know it." After graduation, my dream became a reality. I was selected to fly the F-15E Strike Eagle, a masterpiece of engineering and one of the most formidable fighter jets ever built. The day I got my first assignment to a base in Arizona, I felt an electric surge of triumph, like I'd finally reached the summit of a mountain I'd been climbing my whole life. But then I looked at Sarah, at the gentle curve of her belly, and I understood that this dream wasn't just mine anymore. I had to fly for them now, for her, for our unborn child, and for the promise of a future that was bigger than just me. My father, of course, did not attend the winging ceremony. He sent a telegram. It was brief, formal, and felt as cold as the paper it was printed on. My mother called, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm so proud of you, Liam," she managed to say, but we both knew my father would never have allowed her to come. Finn was the only one who made the trip. He showed up looking a little lost, holding a bouquet of flowers and giving me a slightly awkward hug. "You did it, man," he said, a genuine smile on his face. I smiled back, clapping him on the shoulder, trying to ignore the flicker of something else I saw in his eyes. It was just for a second, but it looked like envy, a small hairline crack in his cheerful facade that I didn't want to acknowledge. Becoming a fighter pilot, I was quickly learning, wasn't just about mastering the machine. It was a constant war fought on three fronts: against myself, against the weight of expectations, and against the deep-seated fears I didn't dare speak aloud. Every time I pushed the throttles forward and felt the thunder of the engines, I was acutely aware that this takeoff could be my last. But I flew anyway. I flew because up there I wasn't the senator's son, I was something more. I was Liam Donovan, a pilot, a man, and soon a father. Yet even as I soared, I could feel the stress fractures forming deep down, in my family, in my own soul. I just didn't know that in the years ahead, the entire structure I had worked so hard to build was destined to come apart in a catastrophic failure, like an airframe breaking up mid-flight. Sarah gave birth to our daughter on a bright spring afternoon in Arizona. The sun was pouring through the hospital window, filling the room with a golden light that felt like a welcome. I stayed right by Sarah's side, my hand gripping hers through every wave of pain. The moment Chloe's first cry cut through the quiet of the room, my own heart seized in my chest. I couldn't breathe. She was so small, so perfect, with a shock of dark hair and her mother's incredible green eyes. When the nurse placed her in my arms, she felt impossibly fragile. "Chloe," Sarah whispered, her voice tired but luminous with joy. "Her name is Chloe." I just nodded, completely overwhelmed, staring down at this tiny human and thinking that this right here was the most profound miracle I would ever witness. For the very first time, I felt the deep, anchoring reality of family. Not the cold, performative institution of the Donovans, but my own small, warm circle of love. We were married soon after, a simple ceremony in the backyard of the little house we were renting. Sarah wore a plain white dress and left her hair down, and her smile outshone the Arizona sun. Standing across from her in my dress blues, I knew with absolute certainty that I was the luckiest man on the planet. My mother flew out for the wedding. She held me in a long, tight hug, and when she saw Chloe nestled in Sarah's arms, she broke down in quiet, happy tears. My father, predictably, was a no-show. He was tied up with some critical meeting in D.C., but he did send a card. Inside, his handwriting was as sharp and economical as ever. "Congratulations. Uphold the family honor." I read it once and dropped it directly into the trash can. Finn came, and this time he brought a gift. A beautiful painting he'd done of Sarah and me standing under a vast star-filled sky. "I hope you're happy, man," he said, his voice sincere. I pulled him into a hug, deliberately pushing away the memory of that strange look I'd seen in his eyes at my winging ceremony. Those first few years of our marriage were, without a doubt, the happiest of my life. We lived in a small house just off base, and our days were filled with a simple, profound contentment. We woke up to the sound of Chloe's laughter echoing down the hallway. And we ended our evenings on the back porch, watching the desert sky bleed into shades of orange and purple over the distant mountains. My career was taking off. I was flying the Strike Eagle, taking part in everything from complex bombing exercises to international training missions. Every flight was a new test of skill and nerve. The crushing G-forces, the deafening roar of the twin engines, the relentless pressure to execute every maneuver with absolute precision. It was demanding, exhausting work, but coming home to Sarah and Chloe made every second of it meaningful. Sarah continued her work at the research center, and even with her own demanding schedule, she was the calm, steady center of our family. "You may be the pilot," I'd tease her, "but you're the one who keeps this whole operation airborne." She would just laugh and pull me into a hug that made everything feel right. But the life of a fighter pilot is never stable. Long deployments became a recurring reality, sometimes stretching for months at a time. I was sent to bases all over the world for joint exercises and operational support. Every time I had to leave, I would hold Chloe so tightly it hurt, promising to bring her back a special present from wherever I was headed. "I'll be back before you know it, okay, sweetie?" I'd say, smoothing her soft hair. Chloe would nod bravely, but the look in her big, serious eyes always felt like a punch to the gut. Sarah would put on a brave face, give me a long kiss, and say, "Fly safely and we'll be waiting." I could see the effort it took, and I knew that behind her smile she was steeling herself for another long stretch of loneliness. During those months away, My world shrank to a sparse dorm room with gray cinderblock walls and a cheap clock whose ticking seemed to mock the slow passage of time. Each second a moment I was missing back home. I called Sarah every chance I got, but the connections from remote bases were often staticky and unreliable. Her voice, traveling across thousands of miles, always sounded faint and distant, like an echo. "Chloe took her first steps today," she told me during one of those calls. I forced a laugh, but my heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. I wasn't there. I missed it. I sent packages home. A beautiful doll from Japan, a delicate bracelet from a market in Germany. But I knew these things were just poor substitutes for my presence. The gifts couldn't make up for the birthdays, the first words, the scraped knees I wasn't there to kiss. When Chloe was 3, my mother began flying out to Arizona regularly to help Sarah. She would stay for weeks at a time, filling our small house with the smell of her cooking, playing with Chloe, and providing Sarah with some much-needed company. "She's so much like you were at that age, Liam," my mother told me over the phone, her voice warm with affection. "She's a strong little thing, but she needs her dad." Her words were a clean, sharp cut. I wanted to be there. I wanted to be the father Chloe needed, but the demands of my career were relentless. With every takeoff, I told myself I was doing this for them, to provide for my family. But every time I landed thousands of miles away, I was overwhelmed by the feeling that I was the one leaving them behind. By the time Chloe turned 5, I started to notice subtle shifts in Sarah. I never for a second doubted that she loved me, but some days a quietness would settle over her. When I'd tell her about a particularly challenging flight, her eyes would seem to be looking at something far away. She started wearing more makeup, a bold red lipstick I'd never seen before, and a new expensive perfume. "I just want to feel like a person again, not just a mom," she said with a shrug when I mentioned it. I nodded, telling myself it was just her way of fighting back against the isolation, of holding on to her own identity. I also realized that she'd stopped complaining about my long deployments. The tearful goodbyes and the frustrated phone calls had been replaced by a kind of placid resignation. "Just go do your job, Liam," she'd say with a small, tight smile. "We're fine." I wanted so desperately to believe her, to believe that our foundation was still solid, but there was an unfamiliar flatness in her voice that sent a chill through me. Chloe, in the meantime, was my entire world. She was a bright, endlessly curious little girl, and she was fascinated by the sky. "How high do you fly, Daddy?" she'd ask, her eyes wide. "Can you see the angels up there?" I'd laugh and swing her up into my arms, telling her stories about racing the clouds and flying so high you could almost touch the stars. I taught her how to fold the perfect paper airplane, and we would spend hours in the backyard watching them catch the desert breeze. Those simple, perfect moments were my antidote to the crushing stress of my job, to the unspoken fear that shadowed every takeoff. The Donovans in DC were still a presence in my life, though I did my best to keep them at arm's length. My father had started to take a new kind of interest in my career, especially after I was promoted and received a commendation for a mission in the Middle East. "Well done, Liam," he said during a rare and stilted phone call. His voice was still cold, but for the first time I could detect a faint trace of something that sounded almost like approval. "You're bringing honor to the Donovan name," he added. I held my tongue. I wasn't flying for his name. I was flying for me, for Sarah, for Chloe. It was a distinction I knew he would never be capable of understanding. Finn had changed too. He still called, but the conversations were shorter, less frequent. During a visit back to DC, I found him more reserved, his easy openness replaced by a guarded distance. He'd found some success as an artist with shows in galleries in New York and Chicago, which I was genuinely proud of. But I noticed that whenever the conversation turned to my work, to my flying, a shadow would pass over his face. That familiar flicker of envy in his eyes was more pronounced now. "Always the hero, huh, big brother?" He'd joked once, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself I was imagining things, but the gap between us was widening, and we both knew it. By the time Chloe was 8, the ground beneath my perfect little family felt unstable. I still believed that Sarah loved me, I had to. But she had pulled away, retreating into a place I couldn't reach. She shared less of her thoughts, and her hugs felt brief, almost obligatory. She started going out more in the evenings, joining a book club, meeting up with friends from work that I'd never met. "I need to have my own life, Liam," she explained, her tone defensive. I just nodded, a heavy feeling settling in my chest. I told myself she deserved it, that she had put her own ambitions on hold for me, for this life. She needed her own space. But every time I watched her get ready to go out, carefully applying that red lipstick, spritzing on that unfamiliar perfume, a cold dread would creep over me. Something was fundamentally changing between us, and I was losing her bit by bit, without ever understanding why. Chloe was the glue. She was the one thing that still held us together. She was growing up so fast, a whirlwind of bright energy, smart questions, and a smile that could disarm me completely. I cherished every moment I had with her when I was home, making a point to take her to the park, teaching her how to ride her bike without training wheels, telling her all of my grandfather's best stories. But I could see the toll my absences were taking. Every time I had to leave for another deployment, a quiet sadness would cloud her eyes, a flicker of fear that this time I might not come back. "I promise I'll be back, sweetie," I'd say, kissing her forehead. But I knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that my promises were never enough to erase her worry. The evening before I was scheduled to leave for a 4-month deployment to Guam, Sarah and I sat on the couch in silence after putting Chloe to bed. I reached for her hand, trying to bridge the distance that had grown between us. "Are you okay, Sarah?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She turned to look at me and offered a smile, but it was a hollow thing that never reached her eyes. "I'm fine, Liam, just tired. Don't worry about me." I wanted to push, to ask her what she was tired of, to break through the wall she had built. But just then my phone buzzed with a call from the base, a final briefing about the mission. The moment was lost. I kissed her, held her a little tighter than usual, and then walked out the door, completely oblivious to the fact that it would be the last time I would ever leave my home, believing my family was still intact. The 4 months in Guam were a monotonous blur of exhaustion and isolation. The mission was demanding, a relentless cycle of long night patrols and exhaustive tactical debriefs. I tried to call home whenever I had a spare moment, but Sarah was becoming more and more difficult to get a hold of. "She's just busy with Chloe," I told myself, but the knot of unease in my gut was tightening every day. During one of our brief video calls, Chloe excitedly told me that Uncle Finn had come all the way to Arizona for a visit. She said she loved painting with him in the backyard. "Does Uncle Finn visit a lot?" I asked, working to keep my voice casual. Chloe nodded enthusiastically, her face lighting up. "Yeah, he comes over all the time when you're gone." I forced a smile for her, but my blood ran cold. Finn? Why was my brother, who lived on the other side of the country, visiting my wife and daughter so often? A dark, ugly thought began to form in the back of my mind, a thought I immediately tried to crush. I was being ridiculous. Finn was my brother, Sarah was my wife. He was just being a good brother, helping her out while I was deployed. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. A week later, my deployment was cut short. As the transport truck rumbled down the familiar highway back toward our quiet Arizona suburb, I was completely unprepared for the brutal reality that was waiting for me. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in streaks of fiery red and orange. I sat in the back of the truck, my duffel bag clutched between my knees, a nervous energy thrumming through me. I hadn't called Sarah to tell her I was coming. I wanted it to be a surprise. 4 months of grueling missions and sleepless nights had left me hollowed out, desperate for the comfort of home. I could almost feel Chloe's small arms wrapped around my neck, could see the relief on Sarah's face as she pulled me into a hug. I had gifts in my bag, a small hand-carved wooden doll for Chloe and a delicate silver necklace for Sarah. I had rehearsed what I would say. I was going to tell her I was sorry, that I would find a way to be home more, that I would never let her feel so alone again. But when the truck finally pulled up in front of our little house, an immediate sense of wrongness washed over me. The house was dark and still, missing the warm, welcoming glow that usually spilled from the living room window. I stepped out onto the quiet street, my bag suddenly feeling impossibly heavy on my shoulder. I walked up to the front door and froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. That cold unease from my conversation with Chloe, the one about Finn's frequent visits, came rushing back, but I shoved it away. "You're just tired. You're overthinking things," I told myself as I slid my key into the lock. The door opened with a soft creak and I stepped into the darkness. "Chloe, Sarah?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silent house. Nothing. I set my duffel bag down by the door and scanned the room. Everything was just as I'd left it. The worn-out sofa, Finn's painting hanging on the wall, Chloe's toys scattered across the rug. But the air felt different. There was a strange scent, a heavy perfume that wasn't Sarah's. It was cloying and unfamiliar. My heart started to pound against my ribs, but I forced myself to take a slow, steadying breath. Maybe they'd just gone out for a little while, maybe they'd be back any minute. Then I heard it, the soft patter of small feet coming down the hallway. Chloe appeared in the doorway wearing the airplane-patterned pajamas I'd bought her for her last birthday. The moment she saw me, her green eyes went wide. "Daddy!" she squealed and ran into my arms, wrapping her little body around my legs. I dropped to my knees and hugged her back, a wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy. "I missed you, Daddy," she chirped, her face buried in my shoulder. But then she pulled back and looked up at me, her expression suddenly filled with a strange anxiety. "Daddy, you have to hide. Under the bed. Mommy's coming home soon." I frowned, completely bewildered. "What are you talking about, sweetie? Why would I hide from Mommy?" I tried to laugh, ruffling her hair, assuming this was just some silly new game she'd invented. But Chloe's grip on my hand tightened and I could feel her trembling. "Please, Daddy," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Mommy said she doesn't want you here right now." Her words landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I stared into her terrified eyes, and for the first time in my life I felt a fear so profound it didn't even have a name. Okay, I heard myself say, my voice a strained imitation of calm. I'll do it." I still don't know why I agreed. Maybe it was the raw panic in Chloe's eyes, the desperate way her small hand was clutching mine. Whatever the reason, I found myself on my hands and knees, awkwardly squeezing my body into the cramped, dusty space under our bed. I felt utterly ridiculous, and a deep, sick sense of dread was beginning to curdle in my stomach. The smell of stale air and old wood filled my nostrils as I lay there in the darkness, my mind reeling. What the hell is going on? A few minutes later, I heard the sound of the front door opening. The sharp, distinct click of Sarah's heels on the hardwood floor was followed by the sound of another voice, a man's voice. It was low, relaxed, and sickeningly familiar. My heart stopped. My entire body went rigid. I knew that voice. I knew its particular rhythm, its unique cadence. It was a voice I had known my entire life. It was Finn, my brother. They walked into the bedroom, and the sound of Sarah's soft laughter was a shard of glass in my gut. "Are you sure Chloe's asleep?" Finn asked, his voice laced with a faint note of concern. "Yeah, she's out cold," Sarah replied, her tone softer and more intimate than I had heard it in years. The bedroom door clicked shut, and the sound seemed to freeze the blood in my veins. I lay there under the bed, every muscle in my body screaming with tension, my breath catching in my throat. A wave of white-hot rage followed by a tidal wave of humiliation washed over me. I could hear them talking, their words muffled but clear enough. I didn't want to listen, I didn't want to understand, but every sound was branding itself onto my brain. "I missed you, Sarah," Finn murmured, and I heard the soft rustle of clothing, the unmistakable sound of two people embracing. Sarah laughed again, and the sound that had once been my favorite in the world was now the sound of my world ending. "You always know just what to say, Finn," she replied, and in that instant I felt my heart shatter into a million irreparable pieces. A primal, violent urge surged through me. I wanted to burst out from under the bed, to splinter the bedroom door with my fists, to scream until my throat was raw. My mind flashed to the wood-splitting axe I kept by the shed in the backyard. I could get it. I could smash my way in there and confront them. The rage was a physical thing, a wildfire consuming me from the inside out. But then my eyes found Chloe. She was standing frozen in the hallway just outside the bedroom, her small face a mask of terror. She didn't make a sound. She just stared at me, her eyes wide and pleading, and in that instant I knew I couldn't. Not in front of her. Not while she was looking at me like that. I pulled myself out from under the bed, my limbs feeling like they were made of lead. I got to my feet, took Chloe's hand, and whispered, "Come on, sweetie, let's go for a walk." She nodded, her little hand gripping mine like a vice. We slipped quietly out of the house, the muffled sounds of their voices still audible from the bedroom. As we stepped out into the cool night air, the first thing I saw was Finn's car parked at the curb, the dark green Mustang he was so ridiculously proud of. I stared at it, and the last fragments of my denial crumbled into dust. This wasn't a one-time thing. This wasn't some drunken mistake. This was a calculated long-term betrayal from the woman I had built my life around and the brother I had trusted completely. I pulled out my phone and called a cab. I was taking Chloe to a hotel anywhere but here. I couldn't stand the thought of her spending another second in that house. "Is Mommy mad at me, Daddy?" Chloe asked in the back of the taxi, her voice so small it was almost a whisper. I turned to look at her, and a fresh wave of pain tore through me. "No, sweetheart," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. "Mommy's not mad at you. She's just confused right now. We'll figure it all out, okay?" Chloe nodded, but I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe me. I didn't believe me either. As we drove, I asked her the question I was dreading the answer to, my voice as gentle as I could make it. "Chloe, honey, does Uncle Finn come over to the house a lot?" She didn't look at me. She just kept staring out the window at the passing city lights and nodded. "Yeah," she said, her voice barely audible. "For a long time. Like since I was 6. Mommy always tells me to go to my room and close the door when he comes over. She said if I ever told you, she would make me leave." Her small body started to shake with silent sobs, and a murderous rage, cold and pure, settled in my heart. 2 years. For 2 years they had been carrying on this sordid affair in my home, under my roof, but that wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it was that they had dragged my daughter into their lie, forcing an 8-year-old child to carry their toxic secret, threatening her into silence. I gripped the armrest of the cab, my knuckles turning white, fighting for control. "You did nothing wrong, Chloe," I said, my voice cracking with the effort of holding myself together. "You hear me? I am so proud of you for being brave enough to tell me the truth. I will protect you. I promise." Chloe nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. I wanted to pull her into my arms and tell her that everything was going to be okay, but the words felt like a lie in my mouth. Nothing was okay. Nothing would ever be okay again. When the cab pulled up in front of the old family house in Georgetown, my mother opened the door before I even had a chance to ring the bell, her face etched with worry. "Liam? What on earth is going on? Why is Chloe with you in the middle of the night?" I told her everything right there in the grand foyer, the words spilling out of me, each one feeling like a fresh cut. She listened in stunned silence, then immediately swept Chloe into a hug and led her upstairs to my old bedroom. When she came back down, tears were streaming down her face. "Oh, Liam," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am so sorry. I had no idea. I never imagined it had gone this far." Just then, my father appeared at the entrance to the living room, still impeccably dressed in a dark suit, as if he'd just returned from a late-night session. I repeated the whole sordid story for him, not bothering to filter the raw, shaking rage from my voice. "Finn and Sarah," I spat. "They've been sleeping together in my house behind my back for 2 years." I expected an explosion. I expected him to share my fury, to stand with me. Instead, he just stared at me, his eyes as cold and hard as granite. "Are you certain, Liam?" he asked, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Do you have proof?" "Proof!" I yelled, the last of my control shattering. "I heard them with my own ears, Dad. Chloe told me everything. She's terrified because Sarah threatened to throw her out of her own home if she said anything." But my father's expression didn't change. Not a flicker of empathy, not a hint of anger on my behalf. He simply sat down in his favorite leather armchair, his fingers drumming a slow, deliberate rhythm on the armrest. "You are an officer in the United States Air Force, Liam," he said, his voice as flat as a runway. "You, of all people, understand the importance of order, of honor. If you make a public spectacle of this, you won't just be destroying Finn's reputation. You will be dragging me down with him. You will be tarnishing the entire Donovan name." I stared at him, my mind refusing to process what I was hearing. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Your son has been betrayed in the most profound way possible. Your granddaughter has been emotionally abused and threatened. And all you can think about is your goddamn reputation?" He didn't answer right away. He rose from his chair, walked over to the large bay window, and stood there for a long moment, staring out into the darkness. "Handle it quietly," he said finally, his back still to me, his voice sharp and cold as ice. "A discreet divorce, no press, no official investigations, and you will not let this get back to your commanding officers. Do you understand me?" A harsh, bitter laugh escaped my lips. "Oh, I understand, Dad," I said, the words dripping with a contempt I no longer cared to hide. "I understand perfectly. You never gave a damn about me. It was only ever about the name." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving him standing there alone in the cold, silent mansion that had never once felt like a home. I flew back to Arizona that same night, leaving Chloe in the care of my mother. I had to face Sarah and Finn, but I knew I had to keep my rage on a leash. I couldn't risk making this any more traumatic for Chloe than it already was. When I walked back into my house, Sarah was sitting on the couch, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She jumped to her feet the moment she saw me, her voice trembling. "Liam, when did you get back? Why didn't you call?" I didn't answer her questions. I just looked at her, at the woman I had loved more than life itself, and felt nothing but a vast, empty canyon where my heart used to be. "Finn," I said, my own voice sounding strange and detached in my ears. "How long has he been here, Sarah?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Liam, I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible. "It's not what you think. I was just so lonely. You were always gone, and Finn, He was here. He listened. Every word was another twist of the knife, but I refused to let her see the agony she was causing me. "And Chloe?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "You threatened our daughter, Sarah. You told her you'd throw her out of her own home. You think that's okay?" A gut-wrenching sob escaped her, and she collapsed to her knees in front of me. "I didn't mean it, Liam, I swear," she cried. "I was just so scared she would tell you, so scared you would find out. I love you, I really do." But her words were meaningless now. I just shook my head and took a step back from her. "No, you don't love me," I said, the truth of it settling in my bones like a deep, permanent chill. "You love the idea of having a man around when I'm gone. But that man isn't me." I turned and walked away, unable to listen to another one of her lies. I had seen enough. I had heard enough. I couldn't spend another second in that house, breathing the same air as her. I found Finn the next day at a small coffee shop downtown. He was sitting at a corner table, his clothes rumpled, his gaze fixed on the tabletop in front of him. He looked up as I approached, his expression a mixture of guilt and fear. "Liam," he said, his voice weak. "What do you want?" I sat down across from him and took off my wedding ring, placing it on the table between us. "If you want her, Finn," I said, my voice cold and steady, "then you can have her. But you will take full responsibility, and you will never ever go near my daughter again." I slid the ring across the table toward him along with a check I had written out the night before. "You can pay for the ring yourself this time." Finn stared at the ring, then back at me, his eyes welling up with tears. "I'm so sorry, Liam," he choked out, but I was already on my feet. I turned and walked out of the cafe without a backward glance. I didn't want his apologies. They were worthless. All I wanted was my daughter, a new life, and a way to erase the memory of everything that had just happened. I went back to the base, self-reported, and officially requested a transfer from active flight duty to a position as a simulator instructor. It wasn't a matter of fear. I just couldn't fly anymore. I couldn't leave Chloe again. Not for a day. I initiated the divorce proceedings immediately. I let Sarah keep the house, the car, everything. I didn't want to fight. My only non-negotiable demand was full custody of Chloe. My father had been right about one thing. This needed to be handled quietly, but I wasn't doing it to protect his precious reputation. I was doing it for my daughter. Chloe and I moved to Boulder on a crisp autumn afternoon. The golden aspen leaves were drifting down from the trees, carpeting the roads as if to welcome us to our new life. I found a small house on the edge of town, a simple place tucked up against the foothills of the Front Range. It had rustic wooden walls, an old stone fireplace, and a big picture window that looked out at the distant peaks. It was nothing like the cavernous, sterile mansion I'd grown up in. There were no expensive paintings or antique furniture. But it felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a place where we could both begin to heal. A place where Chloe could grow up far away from the shadows of our past. Those first few months were hard. I'd wake up every morning with a hollow ache in my chest, the phantom pain of a limb that had been amputated. I had left behind my wife, my brother, and the only life I had ever known. I was no longer a fighter pilot, no longer the man who commanded a strike eagle at the edge of the sky. I was just a father trying to pick up the pieces. I put in for a transfer to the Air Force Academy, the very place my dream had started, to work as a simulator instructor. Walking away from the cockpit was the single most difficult decision of my life. But all I had to do was look at Chloe, at her bright green eyes and her fragile smile, and I knew I had made the right choice. She needed me here, on the ground. And I would never again let her down. Chloe, for an 8-year-old, was devastatingly perceptive. She rarely mentioned Sarah, but I could see the invisible scars she was carrying. "Daddy, is Mommy going to come visit me?" she asked one night as we were eating the lumpy pasta I'd managed to cook for dinner. I stopped, my fork hovering in midair, trying to find the right words, the ones that wouldn't cause her more pain. "Mommy, she's in a different place right now, sweetie," I said, my voice gentle. "But I'm here, and I will always, always be here for you." Chloe just nodded, her gaze dropping to her plate. I knew she was hiding a universe of sadness behind that quiet facade. I got up from my chair, pulled her into my arms, and just held her. "I love you, Chloe," I whispered into her hair. "I love you more than all the sky." She managed a small, watery smile and hugged me back. And in that moment, holding my daughter, I felt a surge of strength. I felt like I could face whatever came next. Slowly, we began to build a new life, just the two of us. I started teaching her all the small, important things a father should. We practiced tying her shoes until she got the loops just right. I showed her how to fold the perfect paper airplane. At night, we'd sit out on the back porch and I'd point out the constellations, telling her the ancient stories behind them. We tried to plant a garden together, filling a small patch of dirt with the daisies she loved. I was clumsy, spilling soil everywhere and nearly drowning the poor flowers. "Daddy," she giggled, "you can fly a super-fast airplane, but you can't even grow a flower." I pretended to be offended, then scooped her up and spun her around until we were both dizzy with laughter. Her laughter filled the small yard, carried on the cool mountain air, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something in my chest begin to unclench. It felt as if the shattered pieces of my life were slowly, painstakingly, beginning to fit back together. In the evenings, we made a ritual of sitting on the back porch with a plate of cookies, watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks of the Front Range. Chloe never tired of hearing stories about her great-grandfather, about his adventures flying in World War II, about how he had to bail out of his burning plane and survive for weeks behind enemy lines. "Daddy," she asked one night, her face tilted up toward the star-dusted sky, "were you ever scared when you were flying?" I smiled and smoothed a stray piece of hair back from her forehead. "All the time, sweetie," I admitted. "But the thing about fear is it's not always a bad thing. It keeps you sharp. What matters is that you don't let it control you. You push through it for the people you love." Chloe nodded, a serious, thoughtful expression on her face, as if she truly understood the weight of what I was saying. And in that moment, I felt a fierce hope that she would grow up with a kind of inner strength I had never been allowed to have as a child. My new job at the academy was a different kind of challenge, but it was also a way for me to find a new sense of purpose. Instead of being strapped into a cockpit, I was standing in front of lecture halls filled with bright-eyed young cadets, all of them burning with the same dream I once had. I taught them the mechanics of flight in the simulators, how to manage the crushing G-forces, how to maintain a calm, methodical mind when the simulated world around them was descending into chaos. I never talked about my commendations or the combat missions I'd flown. Instead, I talked to them about patience, about self-reliance, and about the importance of finding your own way forward, especially after life has knocked you off course. The cadets were a curious bunch. I knew they whispered about me when they thought I wasn't listening, wondering why a decorated Strike Eagle pilot had voluntarily grounded himself. "Major Donovan flew F-15s, I overheard one of them say to another. "Why the hell is he teaching Sims?" I never offered an explanation. I didn't need their approval. But one afternoon, a young cadet named Alex, a blonde kid with a perpetually earnest expression, stopped me after class and handed me a folded piece of paper. "Sir," he said, his voice a little shaky, I wanted to give you this. I admire you. Not just because you were a pilot, but because you chose your family. I think that's the strongest thing a man can do." I took the letter, momentarily speechless. I just nodded and thanked him, a lump forming in my throat. Later that night, sitting alone in my quiet house, I unfolded it. The handwriting was a messy scrawl, but the words were sincere. He wrote that he'd heard the rumors, that he'd seen the way I handled myself, my quiet dignity in the face of the gossip, and that he respected me for it. "You don't just teach us how to fly, sir," the last line read. "You teach us how to be men." Reading those words, I felt my eyes begin to burn. I had always viewed my silence, my retreat from the world, as a kind of weakness, a failure. It had never occurred to me that it could be perceived as strength. After that, other letters started to appear on my desk, small notes of encouragement from other cadets. They started calling me the quiet teacher. They didn't know the whole story, not even close, but they sensed something in the way I carried myself, a quiet resilience, and their unspoken support became a source of strength I hadn't realized I needed. Chloe loved coming to the academy with me on the weekends. She would race around the campus, her eyes wide with wonder as she stared at the sleek training jets parked on the tarmac. One Saturday, I took her into one of the simulators and let her climb into the pilot's seat, her small hands barely big enough to wrap around the control stick. "Daddy, is this what it's really like?" she asked, her eyes sparkling as the wraparound screen lit up with a perfect cloudless blue sky. I laughed and adjusted the miniature flight helmet I'd found for her. "It's close, sweetie," I said, "but the real thing is way up there, and I'm not quite ready to let you go flying off on your own just yet." Chloe giggled and pretended to push the throttle forward, and I just stood there behind her, watching my daughter fly a simulated jet, my heart fuller than it had been in years. In that small, dark room, I wasn't a pilot. I wasn't Senator Donovan's son. I was just Chloe's dad, and for the first time, that felt like more than enough. I started to teach Chloe how to be independent, not because I wanted her to grow up too fast, but because I wanted her to be strong, to know that she could rely on herself. I showed her how to make simple meals, a process that usually ended with us laughing over a pan of burnt scrambled eggs. I taught her how to do small repairs around the house, like changing a light bulb or tightening a loose screw on a cabinet door. "Daddy, do you think I'll be a pilot like you when I grow up?" she asked one night as we were lying on a blanket in the backyard, staring up at the Milky Way. I smiled and ran my fingers through her hair. "You can be anything in the entire world you want to be, Chloe," I told her. "But whatever you choose, all I want is for you to be happy." Sarah and Finn were two names I tried to banish from my thoughts, but they were always there, lingering like ghosts at the edge of my vision. Sarah called a few times, leaving long, rambling voicemails filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. "Liam, I was so wrong," she'd sobbed in one of them, her voice cracking. "I didn't know what I was doing. Please, just talk to me." I never called her back. It wasn't because I still hated her. The rage had faded, leaving behind a vast, empty space. It was because I just didn't have the strength to revisit that pain. Every time I heard her voice, all I could see was the look of pure terror on Chloe's face that night, and that was something I could never forgive. Finn never tried to contact me, and I was grateful for that. My mother told me he had moved to New York to focus on his art, and that Sarah had followed him there. I didn't know if they were still together, and I didn't care to find out. I had left my wedding ring on that cafe table not as a gift for my brother, but as a final, definitive act of severing my ties to that life. My father called me once, months after Chloe and I had settled in Boulder. "You handled that situation well, Liam," he said, his voice as cold and remote as ever. "Maintaining your silence was the correct strategic move." I hung up the phone without saying a word. I didn't need his validation. I hadn't done it for him or for the Donovan name. I had done it for Chloe. As the seasons changed, a quiet sense of peace began to settle over me. I no longer had recurring dreams about flying. The sound of a jet engine passing overhead no longer sent a pang of loss through me. I started to find a deep, sustaining joy in the small, simple moments of my new life. The sound of Chloe's laughter, the feel of the wind in our faces as we rode our bikes down the long hill by our house, the quiet encouragement of the letters from my cadets. I started keeping a journal, not to rehash the past, but to document the present, to capture the fleeting moments of our new life together. "Chloe burned the cookies today," I wrote one night, but she laughed so hard the whole house seemed to shake with it. Reading those words, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. I was still here. I was rebuilding. One morning, Chloe came running into the kitchen clutching a drawing she'd made. It was a picture of a jet soaring high above a range of snow-capped mountains. Down below on the ground were two little stick figures holding hands. "That's you and me, Daddy," she said, her face beaming with pride. I stared at the drawing, and for a second I couldn't breathe. I pulled her into a hug, my voice thick with emotion. "It's beautiful, sweetie," I managed to say, my eyes filling with tears. And in that moment, looking at her crayon drawing, I knew that I had finally found what I had been searching for all along. It wasn't in the sky. It was right here on the ground with my daughter. I don't know what the future holds for us. There are still nights when I lie awake and the ghosts of everything I've lost come to visit. But then I'll hear the sound of Chloe's soft, steady breathing from the next room, and I know, with a certainty that settles deep in my soul, that I don't need to fly anymore. I've already landed. Not because I crashed and burned, but because I made a conscious choice to put the gear down and stay. For Chloe, for myself. This little house outside Boulder isn't the wreckage of my old life. It's the foundation of a new one. It's the place where I'm learning how to breathe again, how to be a father, a mentor, and finally just a man, free from the bindings of the past. The years in Boulder unfolded with the quiet rhythm of the seasons changing in the Rockies, bringing with them a sense of peace I had long ago given up on. Chloe was transforming before my eyes, the shy 8-year-old blossoming into a self-assured 10-year-old whose smile could light up a room and whose questions about the universe were becoming harder to answer. She was my true north. Her rituals, folding paper airplanes with practiced precision, demanding another story about her great-grandfather, or treating the academy campus like her personal playground, were the anchors of my life. She was the reason I got out of bed every morning, the steady pilot light in my soul that never went out. We didn't have a glamorous life, but we had something better. It was ours, and it was enough. Our small house became a map of our shared existence. Chloe's vibrant drawings were taped to every available surface. The daisies we'd planted were thriving in the yard despite my questionable gardening skills, and our little bookshelf was overflowing with the epic adventures we explored together every night before bed. In this space, my old titles fell away like shed skin. I wasn't a pilot. I wasn't Senator Donovan's son, and I wasn't Sarah's husband anymore. I was just Liam, Chloe's dad. It was the only call sign I ever wanted. Then came the inevitable school family day one Saturday morning. Chloe was adamant. "Daddy, you have to come," she insisted, pulling on my arm with all her might, her green eyes shining with an excitement that was impossible to refuse. A part of me recoiled at the thought of crowds and small talk, reminders of a public life I had gladly escaped. But I let out a laugh and allowed her to pull me toward the door. When it came to her, my answer was always yes. After all the betrayal and chaos, the quiet sanctuary of our home was my preferred habitat, but for Chloe, I would walk through fire. Her school was in the heart of Boulder, a cheerful, low-slung building with a sprawling playground, the whole place decked out with colorful welcome banners. The lawn was teeming with families, kids were chasing each other in chaotic circles. and the air was thick with the sweet smell of a bake sale. Chloe was a whirlwind of energy, dragging me from one group to the next, proudly introducing me to her friends and her teachers. Her voice a happy, constant stream of chatter. "This is my dad," she would announce, her chin held high, and the undisguised pride in her voice was a balm to my soul. We ended up at a booth run by a young, friendly-looking teacher named Ms. Albright. She was leading an activity where students could get up and share something about their families. To my surprise, Chloe's hand shot straight into the air. She was clutching a small, crumpled piece of paper she'd clearly prepared. I found a seat in the back, a knot of nerves tightening in my stomach, having no idea what she was about to say. Ms. Albright smiled warmly. "Chloe, would you like to tell us about your dad? What does he do?" Chloe stood up straight and tall, her dark hair pulled back in a high ponytail that swung as she moved. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady, ringing out across the lawn. "My dad teaches people how to fly airplanes," she began. "But he used to be a real pilot who flew super far away. And then he came home. Not because his plane crashed or anything. He came home because he wanted to be with me." She turned and looked right at me, her smile so brilliant it seemed to outshine the sun. In that instant, it felt as though the entire noisy schoolyard had gone completely silent. I just sat there, frozen in my chair, feeling the world slow to a stop. Chloe's words, so simple and yet so profound, went straight through my armor and pierced me to the heart. My eyes started to burn. It wasn't sadness. It was the overwhelming realization that she knew. She understood everything, the choice I had made, the sacrifice, the reason I was here. I had to get up and walk away for a moment, turning my back to the crowd to hide the tears that were streaming down my face. A moment later, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Alex, one of my former cadets who was now a junior instructor at the academy. He had a young family of his own. "Major," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "That little girl of yours, she's really something else." I could only nod, unable to form words. Just then, Chloe came running over and threw her arms around my waist. "Was that good, Daddy?" she asked, her face lit up with a triumphant grin. I knelt down to her level and pulled her into a fierce hug. "It was the best in the world, sweetie," I whispered. "The absolute best." Later that night, long after Chloe was asleep, I sat out on the back porch staring up at the vast star-dusted canvas of the sky. The air was cold and sharp, but I barely felt it. My mind drifted back over the long, turbulent flight path of my life, from the suffocated boy in the senator's mansion, to the fighter pilot who owned the sky, to the broken man betrayed by the two people he should have been able to trust the most. I thought of Sarah, of Finn, of my father, and for the first time I felt nothing. No anger, no bitterness, no pain. They were just ghosts from a previous life, figures from a story that was no longer mine. They didn't define me anymore. I opened my journal and wrote a single sentence. Chloe said I came home to be with her. She's right. I closed the notebook and looked back up at the stars. For so long I had believed that the sky was my true home, the only place I could ever be truly free. But I finally understood. Real freedom wasn't about breaking the sound barrier or pulling G's. It was right here, in this small house on this quiet patch of earth. It was living a simple, honest, and full life with my daughter. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from my mother in Georgetown. She wrote that she was proud of me, not for my accomplishments as a pilot, but for the man I had become, for the way I was raising Chloe. "You have done the one thing your father was never capable of," the last line read, "and you chose family over image." The letter made no mention of my father, Finn, or Sarah. I knew she was deliberately protecting me, and I was grateful. I folded the letter, placed it in a drawer with my other keepsakes, and felt a quiet sense of closure. My mother saw me. That was enough. I had no desire for contact with Sarah or Finn. I'd heard through the grapevine that they were living in New York, that Finn was having some success with his art, and that Sarah had found a job at a private practice. Whether they were still together or not was a question I had no interest in asking. Leaving that ring on the table had been my final word on the matter. It was a clean break. My father never called again, and I didn't expect him to. He would continue to inhabit his world of power and politics, a world that now felt as alien to me as a distant planet. One afternoon during a simulator session, a cadet turned to me and asked, "Sir, do you ever miss it? Do you regret not flying anymore?" The question caught me off guard. My gaze drifted to the window where a T-38 was climbing steeply into the blue, its contrail a thin white scar against the sky. I let a small smile touch my lips and shook my head. "No," I said, turning back to him. Flying was a part of who I was, but it wasn't all of who I am. I found something more important down here. The cadet nodded, a look of understanding on his young face, and I resumed the lesson. But the words echoed in my own mind. It was the absolute truth. I had no regrets. I had chased the horizon, landed on carriers in the middle of the night, and weathered storms, both meteorological and personal. But the most challenging landing I ever had to execute wasn't on a pitching carrier deck or a bombed-out runway. It was the one that brought me home. To Chloe. To myself. Just then, the back door slid open and Chloe came running out onto the porch, a freshly folded paper airplane in her hand. "Daddy, watch this!" she yelled, and with a flick of her wrist, she sent it sailing out into the evening air. It caught a breeze, executed a few graceful loops, and then settled gently onto the grass. She let out a peal of delighted laughter and scrambled down the steps to retrieve it. I stood there watching her, a profound sense of clarity washing over me. This was it. This was the meaning of my life. It wasn't in the medals tucked away in a box somewhere or the number of flight hours in my logbook. It was in the sound of my daughter's laughter, in the trusting way she slipped her small hand into mine, in the simple, powerful fact of being her father. I sat down on the steps beside her as she prepared for another launch. "Daddy," she said, her expression serious, "I want this one to fly all the way up to the stars, as high as you used to fly." I laughed and kissed the top of her head. "It will, sweetie," I said. "But no matter how high it flies, I'll always be right here waiting for you to come in for a landing." As I sit here now writing these final words, I think about all the versions of myself I've been. The pilot, the senator's son, the husband, the brother. All those identities have fallen away. Now I am simply Liam, Chloe's dad, the man who finally found his peace not in the roar of an engine, but in the quiet spaces in between. I've learned that silence isn't weakness, it's a form of strength. It's the way I protect the only thing that truly matters. It's the way I hold on to Chloe. I look up at the night sky, at the distant glittering stars that once felt like my destination. I used to think that was where I belonged, up there among them, but I was wrong. My home is here, on the ground, with my daughter in our little house just outside Boulder. This is where I've landed, and this is where I'll stay.